Just another welcome to everybody here. It's really exciting to have people starting to come back from the summer. We missed you. It was not the same without you. And whenever everyone comes back, it's like a reunion that's going to last for 4 months. But a reunion that you want to last for 4 months. Some other reunions are like 2 days is fine. And we're really grateful. We're loving the whole family's back together. So grateful you guys all made it. And I know the room will keep filling up. I know there are still people coming in. So I'm excited about that. In Galatians chapter 2, before we jump in, I wanted to give you a little background. So first of all, if this is your first time here, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Last weekend, 2 weekends ago, I'm muddy in my head. I think it was last weekend. Time is weird. I don't understand it. But recently, we did a food drive, and a lot of us participated. We passed bags around a certain neighborhood. Owen puts a particularly large amount of work in organizing it. We kind of write on a bag. It goes to a certain nonprofit called the Youth Justice Fund, and it goes to helping people get back on their feet that were incarcerated as youth, get back into normal life. And we raised over 1,000 pounds of food.
That's awesome.
So that's great. Like 1,000 pounds. I know it's hard to picture, like, what is 1,000 pounds? It's a lot. It's a lot of food. And it feeds a lot of people for a long time, and they do a great job allocating that out. So thanks so much for giving that way. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that had happened. We've been in the middle of a series in Galatians. We're about halfway through or so. In the last couple weeks, we've been talking about the first couple chapters, and we're actually still going to be in chapter 2 today. And I want you to know that I had a plan for this sermon, and it changed 2.5 hours ago. Which is a horrifying thing if you're sitting over.
Not spirit-led.
That's right. I hope that most of the sermons we do are thoughtful and heartfelt. This one's extra heartfelt. Because my heart put it together just recently. Originally, we were going to talk about grace. Not that it's ever a bad time to talk about grace. We will still talk about grace. Perhaps it will just go to next week. But something happened this weekend that really just put something else in my heart. And if this is your first time here, I promise, this is not a normal thing. I can count on one hand the number of times this happened in the last 3.5 years since we've been here. But I find it kind of liberating because I don't have this super prepared thing. It's a little bit more from the heart, but it's stuff that's been on my heart a long time. And it's not going to be that new to those of you who have been here for a while. I went to Milwaukee over the weekend. I drove up on Saturday. Got a whoop. Who's whooping? Milwaukee. Okay, you're just pumped. I was like, that's from Milwaukee. California. It's nothing like Milwaukee at all. I was up in Milwaukee because our family of churches, the Ann Arbor Church is a part of a larger family of churches globally. And in the Midwest, we have a really close relationship with those, we call them sister churches. And our sister churches from the Midwest, a lot of the young professional singles got together, so ages really 25 to 35, that was the specific range, got together in north of Milwaukee at a camp and had a conference. And I was given the honor of speaking at that conference on Saturday morning. So I drove 6 hours on Friday, and I spoke Saturday morning, and then I drove 6 hours back on Saturday. Nice. Lots of podcasts and phone calls, and I prayed till I had nothing left to pray about. I prayed for most of you in here. And then I ran out of things, and I got tired. And then I podcasted. And one of the podcasts I listened to was really intense, almost on accident. The podcast wasn't an accident, but I didn't realize how intense it was going to be. And it was a podcast. I won't mention the names of the people in it because it's not really helpful to do it because I don't even remember them. But there was a podcast by a psychologist, and I remember his name, but the guy he was interviewing had grown up in a very war-torn part of the world. And he was talking about his experience growing up. And I don't know if you've ever had a time where you've had almost an out-of-body experience. Maybe you're watching a movie. I remember the first time I ever saw the movie. Has anybody in the movie seen Interstellar?
Yeah.
Yes.
The first time I saw Interstellar, I was like, where am I? I was so engrossed in it that I came out and I saw it in the theater at a matinee. so you come out and you're like, ah! You know what I mean? Like the sun hits you and you're like, I forgot that it was there. I forgot I was on Earth. Like, I had a moment like that when I was listening to this podcast. Have you ever had that moment where you're driving and suddenly you're like, how did I get this far? Like, you're like, I've been driving for 2 hours and I didn't even realize. Like, it's terrifying. There's a part of your brain that's working and another part that's like not engaged. And it was all about this man who grew up in a really war-torn part of the world, and he talks about his experience. And he was in a part of the Middle East. And I was just trying to wrap my head around some of the things that are going on in the world, and I'm telling you, it gave me the shivers. I mean, the things he was talking about, I almost feel like I can't repeat some of the things he said. They were so dark. But he talked about how it was normal for him to watch kids be killed. Because this particularly extremist group would use children as human shields in war. And the reason they did that is because they knew that the global community would send aid, and they had a way to siphon that aid into their banks, essentially. Right? That's a super cursory look at it. This is what his perspective was. And he was actually the son of the leader of this extremist group. And he had betrayed his father to kind of come out of that and speak out against this stuff. Right? And the things he said were just, it was so intense. I mean, it was evil. The things that were happening to children and women and men, but especially the things he was talking about with the kids. And I had, on my ride home, I had limited time to prepare the sermon on grace this week, but I still felt good about it. I mean, that's a topic that's very close to my heart, but I was listening to it and I was just like, man, I had that moment. If you've ever been on a mission trip, you may have had this moment before, where you get back and you're like, what's the point of life? You just feel like, I just gotta sell all my stuff and move to this place and do what? I don't know, but I just gotta go. You know what I mean? Like you have that feeling, you feel bad there's a couch in your living room and a TV on the wall. Perhaps you felt that way before. I had kind of a brief moment like that, kind of a surreal moment. And I was just like, what can a Christian do about that? How do I process this? And I thought that Galatians 2 gave me helpful insight. Right after that, in Ann Arbor Church, we talk a lot about this word, you're probably sick of me saying, this word mishpat, this Hebrew word that means merciful compassion. And there's a story of the Good Samaritan, we won't go over that today, about the man who, the Samaritan who helped the Jew and overcame tons of ethnic boundaries and social norms to help this person. And the whole point was that it's always been God's heart to help the most vulnerable in our communities. Right? In the Old Testament, that was built into the Torah law. It's a very normal thing. It was expected of all Jews and it's expected of Christians as well. Right after that happened, I turned the podcast off early because I was like, I need to process what I'm hearing. I stopped at a rest stop because it had been 4 hours and my whole body was tightening up. And I got out and I went to the restroom and I came back and there was a woman that was sitting at the bench at a rest stop. I had never seen this before. A homeless woman sitting there with the cardboard, the sign like, hey, homeless and need help, and all kinds of things run through my head when I see that. I often make judgments about why that person's there. I often remember wisdom given to me, don't give those people money, they'll use it on drugs. Perhaps you've heard that before. That's often true, but not always true, right? In a sense, it's really up to God. But I just felt I could do this. You know what I mean? This woman's here. And so I was tempted to walk by. I didn't. I sat next to her. I think she was surprised I was sitting next to her. And I said, what's your name? And she said, Jen. My sister's name is Jen, so I was like, you know what I mean? And I shook her hand, and she was, I don't know, she was pretty young. She was probably 50. And I was like, hey, I very rarely talk on this level, because usually I'm busy, I'm going somewhere, Right. And I just said, hey, do you mind me asking, what happened? And she didn't want to talk about it, and that was fine. And I said, do you have any family that can help? And she's like, I have no one. Can I say, pray for me? So we sat down and we prayed together. And I asked her what I could pray for. She'd been applying for jobs and living in her car. And I gave her some money. And usually I'll give food to people that are in that space. And, what she did with that money, well, it's between her and God. Right. But I just remember thinking I have limited ability to help people around the globe that are in extreme poverty. Yeah. There are things you can do, a lot of great things. One nonprofit organization called World Vision is particularly, I think, powerful in that way. Our church supports a nonprofit called Hope Worldwide. There's ways you can send money that's super effective and it goes into the right hands. But I was like, with this, I can touch this one. You know what I mean? Like I can connect with this person. In Galatians chapter 2, in Galatians 2, Paul has just gotten done in the first 2 chapters talking about the kind of the beginning of his mission, the beginning of his conversion, and we won't go over it now, but Paul's conversion is very dramatic. He was a persecutor of God's people, and he became their greatest champion. And besides Jesus, and some would argue Peter, perhaps the greatest evangelist to ever live. And he talks about kind of his interactions with the disciples. And in verse 7, he's in Jerusalem, which is kind of the center of Christianity, where all the big wig leaders are in Christianity. And he says about them in chapter 2, verse 7, on the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter did to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, when they recognized the grace given to us, to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they the circumcised. And when he says the circumcised, he means the Jewish people. Right? The Gentiles are every other nation. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager all along to do. All they asked, the only thing they asked, don't forget the poor. I wonder what that would have felt like to Paul. What I love about his response, he says that was the very thing I had been eager to do all along. That's always been my heart. Title of today's sermon is Invisible People. What it means to love the unseen. You know, why do you think it is that the apostles told Paul when he was leaving for his missionary journey, of which he went on several, don't forget the poor? Perhaps there's a lot of possibilities. Part of what they almost certainly meant was don't forget the poor in Jerusalem. And especially the disciples, you see this happen in Paul's ministry. He often collects money from around the world and sends back to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was under particular persecution and was particularly poor. The church in Jerusalem was very, very poor. And he would often collect from poor churches that willingly gave for the work back here. But certainly, they don't just mean God's people. That's not specified here. Why do you think that is? I think they were convinced of Paul's fervor evangelistically. Paul had been a Christian for at least 14 years at this point, and they knew what Paul was about. But maybe they didn't know if Paul was overemphasizing one part of the mission and underemphasizing the other. Perhaps they had seen this before in evangelists, so they said, don't forget about the poor. I think it's because the poor are often forgotten and easily forgotten. How often have you been stopping on the side of the road and someone walks by the door and you look the other way because you don't want to make eye contact, because you don't want to make them think you have something? Have you had that before? Or a time when you feel uncomfortable when someone is by you that you perceive perhaps as homeless. What do I do? That feeling, I don't think is from God.
Right.
I think we have to work ourselves out of it with a greater compassion, perhaps even a greater conviction about how to love and help the poor. You know, in the aftermath, and I've told this before, but it's been a little while, in the aftermath of World War II, Europe was in shambles. Right? If you study, you don't have to do very much study to know this, but German-occupied Europe was just, the infrastructure was destroyed. And the world came together and created what at the time came to be known as the World Bank. And the idea was that all the world would contribute to this World Bank. And it would flood money into Europe to rebuild the infrastructure. And it was a miracle. Even they couldn't believe how successful it was. While when the world comes together and pools our resources for one common goal, we got this thing done in a much sooner, that was going to be bad grammar, guys, a much sooner amount of time. School's about to start today, I'll get back to it. Much more quickly than they ever thought it could. I don't have the exact figures, certainly. And so, perhaps you've heard of the war on poverty. Some of the presidents in our fairly recent past have conducted what was known as the war on poverty. Trillions and trillions of dollars based on the principle and the success of the World Bank, were poured into the task of overcoming poverty. It was determined that poverty is the greatest blight of human civilization, and the primary propagator of war and inequity, and whether that's true or not is kind of besides the point. It's a problem worldwide, a big one. And it didn't work. No matter how many trillions of dollars are poured in, what they found is that it had an impact, but really, in context, a fairly minimal impact. So they began to ask, why is that? Why has this not made an impact? And so the World Bank conducted a research study where they said, maybe we're asking the wrong people what the real problem is. I think we've assumed the problem was material, was fiscal, financial. Maybe we're looking at this wrong. And so they interviewed about 100,000 people that live below the poverty line around the globe. Some extreme poverty, some majority world poverty, some first world poverty, second world poverty. And you know what the resounding realization was that actually the greatest problem that people that were actually impoverished felt wasn't that they didn't have money, although of course that was a problem. It was that they had no dignity. They were unseen. Their voice didn't matter. They had no purpose. They were just extra. Garbage is what some say. And there's a whole book called Voices of the Poor, I think. Actually, I don't think I have it written down correctly. But it's quotes from this. It's the findings, right? I want to offer you some statistics. So, why is it that on every nonprofit website you see this? Right? It kind of feels like a cheap shot, a little bit. Like, all right. It's because it's effective, because it's real. It's one thing for an adult to be in poverty, which is a terrible thing. But I think to all of us, it's quite another to think of a child not having food. Like it hits you in a whole other way. And not just poverty, but vulnerability. Mm-hmm. It goes further than just simply material poverty. When God talks about helping the poor, it doesn't just mean the materially poor. It means the vulnerable in your community, right? Those that don't have what they need to move forward or to become whole. Some startling statistics about poverty. 1 in 6 children in America live in poverty. 1 in 6. That's a lot. 20%. 17.8% of kids in Michigan live below the poverty line, which means they're categorized as having food insecurity. Perhaps you've seen those banners on the side of the road that's like 1 in 6 kids may not get a meal today. It's called food insecurity. They're far enough below the poverty line where they're not sure if they're going to get it. About half of that, 8%, are in what's called extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is when people make 50% of the low level of the poverty line. Like you have a poverty line that categorizes you as under the poverty line or impoverished. If you make 50% of that, it's considered extreme poverty. 8% of children, that's a big number. Considering that there are, in America, there are 75 million children, which means 1 million children live in poverty, or 11 million children, excuse me. There are a lot of factors that go along with this, right? But I want to talk about another facet of this that I think has become increasingly noticeable to me and is a real problem even just statistically in America. And it's the problem of fatherlessness. This is a really big problem in our culture. And the reason I bring it up is because fatherlessness often correlates to what, as Christians, we consider vulnerability. 1 in 4 children in America do not have what's categorized as by this government website as a present father. Which those people, statistically, those kids, are twice as likely to suffer in mental health and 4 times more likely for their family to be in poverty. They are 10 times more likely to abuse substances and 20 times more likely to be incarcerated in jail at some point. 20 times. Now, that statistic is a fairly general one. It's hard to know for sure. That was very startling to me. I knew it was high, but I couldn't believe how high. What's the point? I'm not just trying to make you feel bad, I just trying to introduce you to realities that I believe we actually can do something about. And I think as Christians, we're called. I think the reason Peter and James and John says don't forget is because it's so easy for us to forget. Yeah. Let us not forget. In Luke 12:48, really convicting passage. For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. Yeah. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. I really do believe that living in the time we live in, and I've said this recently, but if you live on even what's considered a low, even minimum wage in America, you are 99.9% more wealthy than everyone that's ever lived in the history of the world. You are the 0.01% of wealthiest people to exist on the planet ever. And a lot of it's because of technology changing. It doesn't mean that first world poverty is not crushing. And in fact, that's my point. Most of the people who are in poverty are in what's called first world poverty that's around us. But it's a real problem, and it creates so much vulnerability in society. I really believe that in our church, that I feel like I know very intimately, we have been entrusted with much. There are so many gifted people in here. There are so many people here that are functioning adults. Can I get an amen to being a functioning adult? Or at least halfway functioning adult?
There you go.
3 out of 10 days. No. Most of the time, right? Martin's like 2 out of 10 days functioning adult, right?
There you go.
And that's enough for us, and we love him, no matter what. There is so much to give that has nothing to do with money. But it's hard to find your spot. And I have found that to be one of the greatest challenges. Where do I serve and how? When I was in Gainesville leading a college ministry there, I found it was like there was like a line outside the door of every food kitchen, like metaphorically, to like serve them food. Because it was such an easy, like we're all thinking like such an easy way. And of course that's a great thing. Meeting immediate material needs is very important. That's why we do our food drives. It has to happen. But there are greater needs with an exponential power that can be met. I read a book 4 years ago that really changed my thinking about this. It's called When Helping Hurts. And the whole idea is that there are ways that we can think we're helping when we're really just enabling behavior. And one of the conclusions of the book was that if you can find a way to give back that moves towards people development and moving people out of generational cycles of vulnerability, that is where the true difference is made. Now, of course, in the church, one of the things we do is we reach out to people. We study the Bible people. We help them become followers of Jesus. And there may be no more important work to helping the vulnerable than that. Because one of the things we're doing is we're helping people become amazing moms, grandmoms, dads, granddads, husbands, amazing single men and women, amazing college students, like helpful, thoughtful humans. It's impossible to measure the impact we can make in that way. But it may be possible to measure some of our impact by how many of us devote ourselves very specifically in a hands-on way to the vulnerable in our community. And I believe that call is for us. One of the ways that we serve is we serve the nonprofit organization called Friends Indeed. And many of you know this. There's a organization called Circles. The Friends Indeed is the organization, and the Circles is the program. And what they do is they work with families stuck in generational cycles of material poverty. And through having an ally, Kathy Britton, are you still on the board of that group? Kathy's she works super hard. She's done a lot. She's an ally. She's on the board. I'm just kidding. I don't know. She does great things for it. She's really invested in it. And a lot of us are invested in it. Once a month, a different group of ours gets together and we feed the group that comes somewhere between 40 and 80 people. And that's what's intimidating. You never know. You're going to have 40 or 80. That's why Chad makes a lot of sauce on those days for the spaghetti. You know what I'm saying? And that's a great thing. I love that because it's moving towards the development. It's people learning how to help themselves get out of these cycles. I have found that for me, food drives, as great as they are, even serving food in that capacity, is a beautiful thing. And for some of us, it's really the most we can do, and I think it's great. And I don't think we should feel guilty about that. I have found that for others, though, it's not quite as hands-on. And when you're not as hands-on with individuals and touching them and being with them and connecting with them as a friend, you can lose sight of what's all around us every day, of the evil. I will go so far as to say the evil. There's a spiritual battle, and poverty is a weapon that Satan wields with brutal impact.
Come on.
We can get very disconnected from those realities. I can. It's why when I was listening to this podcast, I was so shook, because even though I care a lot about this, I just felt like, man, I feel like this summer I've just not been there. And that's right. to a certain degree, like, that's kind of expected, and it's okay. Like, this isn't just like, so feel super guilty now. Like, this is not a guilt thing. It's meant to inspire change because we're motivated by the right things.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, by Jesus and by grace and by our desire to help. You know, I think that there's a lot of confusion about what justice is today. There's a lot of confusion about where we should spend our time. Enough so that some years ago I was just like, what do I, like, where do I encourage the church to spend our time? Of course, you individually can do whatever you want to do, but I find that it helps if I can give people clear opportunities, like a clear lane to move through. And I felt like of all the things, there's a lot of controversy about who to help and how, but there's no controversy about helping children. Zero.
Yeah.
So I'm like, so that's where I'm going to spend. And you can make the argument it could have the greatest long-term potential impact, right? And so we got connected to, as you know, Big Brother, Big Sisters, which is a mentoring organization. I want to read you some really encouraging statistics from Big Brother, Big Sisters, okay? So, if you can read this. So, they have this on their website. This is kind of their research over the last 20 years or so, perhaps even more, I'm not sure how long it is, on the impact that you make if you're able to serve as a mentor in some capacity. I'll explain that in a second. Kids who went in this program are almost always in a lower income situation. We mostly work with lower income schools. Often it is the case that they're in vulnerable situations in their family, whether that means poverty, fatherlessness, motherlessness. I mean, it goes both. Usually the mom is there. About 80% of the time, single parent households, the mom is there. Moms are obviously incredible. 46% of the kids that have a mentor are less likely to begin using illegal drugs. 27% less likely to use alcohol. 52% less likely to skip school. 37% less likely to skip a class, and 33% likely to hit someone. Great, you know what I mean? Like, we don't want to go down that road. Those are big numbers.
Yeah.
Those are really big numbers. And when they went back, after a certain amount of time, about 10 years or so, they'd go back and talk to these kids after they were 17, 18, 19, and they were like, okay, does this make a long-term impact then? Right? Like, we can feel good about ourselves, but is it actually affecting change? 90% of the kids they interviewed later believed that having a big helped them make better choices in childhood and adulthood. 76% said their relationship with their big mostly learned, it was the primary person who taught them right from wrong.
Wow.
It's just like 76%.
Wow.
Why? It wasn't how much time the big spent with the littles. What they found, it was just the fact that there was someone in their life that had been through life that cared about them.
Yeah.
That is like the common denominator research indicator. Like, does someone care about me? When I was talking to that woman, and she said, I have no one, I was just like, dude, what? Like, that is a tragedy.
Yeah.
Of course, that's one of the many beautiful things about the church. As dysfunctional as all churches are, one of the things I mentioned when I went to Milwaukee is that it's easy to be a critic of the church, but then when you internalize that the church is a rehab center, you're less critical. Because if you walk into a rehab center, you're like, man, these people are just like all over the place. You're like, where do you think you are? You know what I mean? You're like, we came here because we're messed up. Like, that's sort of the point that's supposed to be the point of church. It doesn't always feel that way. The church doesn't always do a great job producing that. But that's why love is what sets us apart. Not just for one another, but also for the vulnerable. And I just really want to encourage everybody here. I really want to make clear that there are two ways for me to approach this. One, I can try to guilt you into like serving as a mentor. The problem with guilt is that I feel guilty if I guilt you, which I don't want to feel. Two, it's not a good primary motivator.
Right.
Guilt is kind of like when your car stalls out and overheats, you pour water in the radiator to get to the shop and they fix the radiator. You're not supposed to run on it.
Right.
Guilt is good to get to the shop.
Yeah.
And I don't feel guilty using it to help people think. This is more about, I think we all have big hearts for God and we want to help people. I think this is our best avenue to do so.
Yeah.
And if there's another thought in your head about how to do that, and I think some of you are doing things that no one knows you're doing, keep doing that thing and feel free to never tell anybody because God sees it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I know is every time I talk about big brother, big sister, this is kind of a family moment. So if you're new to the church, you're a little bit excluded from this, so you can rest assured this isn't for you. But I can feel like there's a lot of initial desire. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to send around a clipboard. And I thought about, should I do this? But it's the easiest way so we don't forget. I'm going to send around a clipboard in a second. And those of you that are interested in being a mentor, either an ally for circles or for big brother, big sisters, you can just write your name down, and I'm going to set up a meeting to explain it more and to help you move forward. I've done this 2 times. I always get a ton of names, and no one follows through. I think it's because we forget. Maybe we realize we can't. And of course, it's fine if you can't do that. Amen. Like, I do trust the group, but I think that it's not always because we've really thought about it. I think it's because it's just not, we need the reminder Peter gave Paul, like, don't forget. Like, lock it in. And make a difference. It's a beautiful thing when you can't measure a difference you're making, because it makes it more heartfelt. What I mean by that is, you know when you do a good thing and no one will ever know, and you'll never even know if it worked. But that's maybe the most beautiful thing that a Christian can do. That's the best thing you can do, because it proves at least to yourself that you're genuine.
Right.
Like, no one saw that I did this, and that's why I did it. Right? Now I'm asking you to write your name down in this thing, so it's like someone's gonna know, you know what I mean? And if you're sitting in the back, that person's definitely gonna know everybody. I think sometimes for me, what has stopped me in the past is laziness, selfishness. I'm not connected to the realities of the world. I'm worried I won't be helpful, or that I'm not the right person. I guarantee you are. I've had the honor of serving in Big Brother, Big Sister, and my little is like my buddy. And every time I get to Estabrook, the elementary school, and to meet Darion, I'm not even joking with you, like 3 kids walk up to Rachel, who's spoken here before. Rachel is the program coordinator. She's a great girl. And they're like, hey, is there anybody, do you have a big for me? I'm telling you, and she has to be like, oh, we're still looking, and the kid's just like, okay, like, it's just like, oh, like, I'm just watching it, I'm like, oh, man, like, come on, Ann Arbor Church, like, that's how I feel, like, that's, like, where I have influence. And I think right now there's, like, 10 to 15 kids on the waiting list, and what a couple of us do is there's 2 programs, I wasn't able to the first one, and so I just go on Wednesday for 45 minutes and just play with them after lunch, and to blast. And it is a fairly low level of commitment, but I have found a commitment in my heart to be so good for me. And so it's not even just for like what we do for other people. It's amazing when you help other people what it does for you. It's the same thing I feel about giving financially. It's always weird to talk about giving financially in the church as the minister. It's a very odd thing. I don't ever feel worried about the money because God will provide, or He won't, and then He'll make clear the next step. I really feel people need to give. You got to give for you, because money is such a trap. And if you're not generous with your money, you will inevitably become greedy and tight-fisted. And we all know we don't want to be that person with our time or our money or our energy. So, as I said, my hope is that we'll be intrinsically motivated by all the right things to do this. And again, there's a lot of trust from me to the church in this. But I did feel like a little bit of a family talk was necessary, because I've often felt like we haven't fully come through. And some of us can't do it because of work or because of the kids at home. Amen. You're doing a beautiful thing, but some of us can't. I just want us to encourage you to really consider that, because of the impact we can make long term. You hear what I'm saying? Yeah. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass this around once the Lord's Supper starts. That is our semi-awkward transition into the Lord's Supper. I was like, I can make this smooth, or I can just do it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to Lord's Supper. And our time Lord's Supper, again, if this is your first time, we just take a little bit of time to remember what Jesus did. And we're going to sing a song today through that time. And you should have communion on your seat. Raise your hand if you didn't have one. One will be brought to you. And we're going to say a prayer and sing and reflect on that. I'm going to pass this around. If it doesn't get to you, we'll put it on the table at the end of service. Love you guys. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for who you are. And we know that you have loved us in a really vulnerable place. And we know, I don't understand how it works, why people are born in the situations they are and why others are not. And it's easy for me to feel like, why was I given this good thing? And I don't. You never answer that question. You just give me a command.
Yeah.
Because you've been given much, give much. And that's how I want to live my life. Like, I don't want to get to the end of my life and my biography is boring, right? Like, I don't want to get to the end of my life and I didn't do anything worthwhile for the people around me. I believe we all want to be people who our lives are a living sacrifice in measurable ways and in immeasurable ways. I want to pray, too, a special prayer just for, this is one of those big prayers that it's hard to know what it does, but I trust that you're sovereign and you're almighty. Just for the children around the world that are in the most extreme circumstances of poverty, in war-torn places. Right now, I think about certain areas in the world that are just brutal places for children to grow up. And there, of course, are brutal places for the kids to grow up right here in Ypsi and Ann Arbor and all around this town, God. I pray that you really help direct us to those people, fill our hearts with all the right things, God, and help us to do it because of what you did for us, God. We believe you saved us when we didn't deserve it. You loved us out of our most vulnerable. You took on our sin at the cross. And we love you for that, and we want to live for you for that. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.